Chapter 7. Grayson did not acknowledge our conversation from that night, offering no explanation nor apology for his unusual behavior. I was beginning to wonder if he had been a bit drunk, although thinking back to the way he had balanced himself so easily on the ship's railing, it seemed unlikely. To be honest, I wasn't sure what had gotten into me. Perhaps the alcohol had affected me more than I thought. Whatever was in Grayson's bottle had been quite strong, so even the few sips I'd taken could have clouded my judgment. I had occasionally flirted with my father's low-ranking men in the same way whenever I was bored, or when father had annoyed me in some way. It was harmless, and had never resulted in anything more than a few minutes of fooling around in an empty storage room or a secluded section of the gardens. What exactly was I hoping to gain by applying that attitude towards Grayson? The same? Try as I might, I couldn't quite put that idea out of my mind. Then again, perhaps it was only because I knew how much it would infuriate my father to know that I had fraternized with a pirate. The majority of the crew continued their unspoken agreement to avoid me. I suspected this was, in part, thanks to some well-placed threats from Grayson. I caught him scolding them once or twice for staring too long at me. I was loath to admit it, but it did make me feel better to know that the pirates weren't likely to follow through on any of the ideas I knew they had in their minds. It was an afternoon, less than a week later, when I made my way above deck to find it busier than usual. Weapons were being sharpened, barrels were being moved, and several of the crew were hoisting a Spanish flag onto the mast. I stood watching them for a few moments before a hand landed on my shoulder, making me jump.
"Morning,"
Grayson said in my ear, uncharacteristically cheerful. I swatted his hand away, fighting the blush that rose to my cheeks. "What's going on?" I asked, nodding towards the flagpole. "You're going to attack another ship, aren't you? That's why you're putting that flag up." A small smile found its way to Grayson's face.
"Aren't you clever?"
He stuck his hands in his pockets.
"I'd like a word with you in private, if you don't mind."
His tone was polite enough, but it wasn't really a request. He didn't even wait for me to respond before turning to head below deck. Reluctantly, I followed, stepping aside on the staircase to narrowly avoid another crewmate as he came bounding through. Grayson led me down the hallway and opened one of the doors, reaching around to give me a nudge inside. I recognized the room immediately. It was the same one I'd woken up in on the first day of this nightmare. Grayson followed and closed the door with a sigh.
"Right. This isn't going to be pleasant, but it'll be easier for both of us if you don't give me a hard time."
I furrowed my brow and started to ask what he was talking about before I noticed multiple coils of rope by the door. My eyes widened as he picked one up. "What are you doing?"
"There's going to be a bit of excitement today, and there's a chance it could get messy. The captain has asked me to ensure that you stay well away from the action."
"I can just stay in your cabin," I argued. "You don't need to—" He shook his head, swiftly cutting off my protest.
"I might have fallen for that if I hadn't witnessed you attempt to drown yourself just a few weeks ago. I can't take any chances with you."
He took a slow step towards me.
"And even if all does go well, I don't want to risk anyone becoming aware of your presence here. I'm sure you understand how disastrous that would be."
My eyes flicked instinctively towards the door. It did not escape his notice, and he let out another long-suffering sigh.
"You're going to insist on doing this the hard way, aren't you?"
Grayson moved, almost before I could think. It was only after he had already seized my left arm and forced it behind my back that I began to struggle, scrambling to either push him away or pull from his grasp. But he spun me around with ease and captured my right arm next. I felt a rope loop around my wrists, and with a burst of adrenaline and heat rushing up my neck, I jerked backwards and drove my elbows directly into his stomach. Somehow, the maneuver succeeded. I heard him grunt, more out of surprise than real discomfort, but his grip on my arms loosened, allowing me to slip free. My freedom was short-lived. The next thing I knew, I hit the ground hard, air abandoning my lungs for several crucial seconds. Grayson made full use of those seconds, hands closing around my arms and planting his knees on either side of me, trapping me against the floorboards. He was impossibly fast, and completely impervious to my struggles as he folded my arms on top of one another against my back, with my wrists touching their opposite elbow, and before long he had them snugly bound there. Stunned, I tried to separate my arms. My arms were trapped at 90-degree angles, rendering both of them useless. Grayson, still with a length of rope, took advantage of my momentary distraction and slipped a band underneath my waist, passing a loop around my torso just below my chest. His fingers came dangerously close to my breasts, and I yelped in surprise, twisting around to try and look up at him. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I spat. He didn't spare me so much as a glance, focused intently on the web he was weaving as he made yet another pass around my waist.
Like I said, I'm not taking any chances with you.
I felt the cords tighten around me, and then he wound the rope again, this time right beneath shoulder level. A tug. The ropes pulled hard on my chest, and a sound came out of my mouth that I didn't recognize. It was somewhere between a yelp and a gasp, high-pitched, but not quite the sound of displeasure I had expected it to be. Blood immediately rushed to my face and I froze, a feeling of absolute mortification washing over me as I realized what had just happened. I felt Grayson pause above me. Heart pounding, I waited to see what he would do, keeping my head angled towards the ground so he couldn't see how badly my cheeks were burning. I prepared myself for some kind of remark from him. Surely he had a witty comment sitting on his tongue, ready to rail off so he could further relish my utter embarrassment. But there was only silence. And after another moment, his hands once again picked up where they left off and finished the tie. I pressed my lips together as the ropes dug into me to prevent any more unbidden noises from escaping. My arms became inextricably glued to my back. When Grayson hooked a hand around them and pulled, the entire top half of my body rose a few inches off the ground. Satisfied, he lowered me, whilst I strained to no avail. The knots were not budging, and the floor started to spin underneath me as I realized just how vulnerable I found myself. We hadn't even reached the worst of it. Grayson leaned closer to my ear.
I apologize in advance for this next part.
Something about the way he said it made shivers run down my spine. I twisted to look over my shoulder at him again, but he had already moved off of my back, and one of his hands clasped around my ankles while the other grabbed the hem of my skirt and pushed it up. I shrieked. Evidently, he had anticipated the attempted kick at his head and leaned back, holding my legs down. Air touched my very bare calves, and an instinctual horror took such strong hold of me that it took a moment to realize that he hadn't actually pulled the skirt past my thighs. In that moment, he had already begun winding yet more rope around my ankles, neatly coiling and then wrapping it vertically in between, forming hempen cuffs. He moved up to my knees and applied rope just below them in the same fashion, fingers grazing my skin almost teasingly. It was hard to keep myself from shuddering with each pass he made. The more he brushed against me, the more hyper-aware I became of his touch, the more my skin prickled in what might have been anticipation. I nearly had to remind myself to struggle, now that I was doing it more out of spite than any actual hope to get free. As he pulled the last knot closed, his hands lingered on my calf. For just a tad longer than necessary, and an unsettling warmth shot through my body. Strange thoughts began intruding upon me, forcing their way into my head. I was bound and entirely helpless, powerless to stop him should he decide to do anything else. Touch me anywhere else, anywhere he wanted. Such ideas should have upset me. I should have been afraid. My thighs were clenched. Why were my thighs clenched? I was quickly snapped out of the daze when Grayson tugged a length of rope he had attached to my ankles, forcing my legs to bend backwards. I resisted out of instinct, puzzled, until I felt him attach the other end of the rope to my bound arms. "Are you serious?" I hissed, unable to contain the comment. Grayson did not deign to respond, swiftly closing the knot and then giving the tether an experimental tug. It held fast, limiting my range of movement even further. I clenched my teeth together so hard that my jaw ached. There had been little chance of me escaping as it was, and so the least he could have done, I thought, was allow me the small luxury of stretching my legs. He checked each one of the knots that held me immobile before leaning back with a sigh.
That should keep you out of trouble,
he said.
Won't be more than an hour.
Oh, only an hour, I snarled, thrashing, but only succeeding in rocking my body from one side to the other. I heard him rifling around in his pocket, and craned my neck to see what he could possibly be doing now. Without warning, his hand appeared in front of my face, and forced what felt like a large fabric knot between my teeth, filling my mouth. The ends of the cloth were pulled against my cheeks and tied together at the back of my head. And just like that, he'd robbed me of any further objections. I let out a muffled protest and glared over my shoulder. But it only made him smirk, grey eyes glinting in amusement.
Behave yourself. I'll let you out once it's over. Maybe.
He added that last maybe with a mischievous grin, and although it was clearly just an attempt to rile me, it pushed me over the edge. I shouted some unladylike things at him through the gag, struggling harder as he stood and walked away. He didn't even look back as he threw the door open, slamming it shut behind him. I struggled feebly for a few minutes out of principle, but not only was there absolutely no chance of escape from the bonds he'd put me in, I had already exhausted myself. I had no choice but to give up and sulk, reflecting on the humiliation I'd just endured, and how easily and effortlessly he'd overpowered me and bound me like a neatly wrapped package. My resistance had barely even hindered him. Perhaps more frustrating, however, was the fact that my body was continuing to have entirely the wrong reaction to all of this. The ropes pressing down on my chest and keeping me tightly restrained were not as uncomfortable as they should have been. Waves of a strange tingling sensation kept ripping through my lower abdomen and settling into the space between my legs. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't seem to make it stop. What was wrong with me? I had just been held down and tied up by a pirate, I reminded myself, something that any sane person would describe as unpleasant at the least. So why was there an increasingly insistent yearning in between my thighs? I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would help. I tried to focus on my anger at Grayson for treating me like this. But the irritation was fading alarmingly fast, as I couldn't help but notice that, despite all that had transpired, he hadn't actually hurt me. The ropes weren't even particularly rough or chafing. This struck me as odd, and shifting, I carefully rolled onto my side. Wincing, as the movement put more strain on the muscles in my arms and shoulders. When I looked down at myself, I was able to confirm that the rope I was bound with looked soft, different from the rough nautical type that had been used on me when I'd first been abducted. This was much gentler against my skin, and I couldn't imagine that it was anything they used for rigging on deck, not with the amount of rain and seawater flying around. The fabric in my mouth, too, was softer than I would have expected, which I discovered when I began trying to push it out with my tongue. It also seemed to be clean, as opposed to the one filled with salt and dirt that I'd been gagged with before. I blinked myself back to my senses. What did it matter? The fact remained that I had once again been trussed up and left alone, which was enough to warrant more distress than I currently felt. Before long, I heard men's voices shouting. I strained, but couldn't make much out. And I remembered what Grayson had said about things getting messy. Anxiety prickled at my insides as I tried to imagine what might happen if this situation did become violent. Was it possible for someone to make their way down here and find me? And would that be a good thing or a bad one? Perhaps, were I to be found and rescued, this whole ordeal would finally end. I could be returned home, safe and sound. And then likely never be allowed to leave the estate unaccompanied again. The thought immediately put a damper on the entire fantasy, and I discarded it. Something struck the deck above me, and my head jerked upwards, staring at the ceiling as though I could somehow see through it if I looked hard enough. No luck. But the shouting increased in volume, above it all rising the unmistakable booming voice of Captain McFarlane. Another thud, then a crack. That pierced through the floorboards. So loud and clear that I might have thought it had come from this very room had I not known better. My blood ran cold. A gunshot.